And again, let me thank CPDC for this opportunity to participate in this webinar, which I think is extremely important and timely. Um, my presentation today is actually based on a study that was done for CPDC. The study is entitled Beyond Loss and Damage, a Climate Reparations Framework for Caribbean Small Island Developing States. The central argument is straightforward, but politically significant. What it argues is that climate finance for Caribbean states must move beyond the current model based on loans and humanitarian response towards one of reparations. The study asks us to rethink climate finance through various lenses, the lens of history, responsibility, debt, law, and fiscal justice. It argues that Caribbean countries are not simply vulnerable because they're small islands, but their vulnerability has historical precedent produced by colonial extraction, the plantation economy model, ecological degradation, debt dependence, and constrained policy space. And during the presentation, I'll make is based on 4 key points. First, why the Caribbean's climate crisis is really a debt and justice crisis. Second, why reparations are legally, scientifically, and economically defensible for the region. Third, how then could we quantify this climate debt? And given that quantification, fourth, how could a reparations framework be put together and implemented in practice? The argument, as I said, it could be summarized in one sentence, really. Climate reparations are not charity. I think that is something that has to be emphasized. They are corrective justice flows for externally driven harm that has been magnified by a historically produced vulnerability. And the study links this argument through 4 stages. One, first, historical extraction, which shaped Caribbean economies around the plantation model for production, export to the metropole, dependence on the metropolitan, limited diversification, and of course, external control. I think Imana has highlighted this aspect, I think, extremely well. Second, this structure has produced fiscal fragility, and that's reflected in high debt, a narrow revenue base, limited policy space, and of course, a heavy dependence on external finance. Third, climate change now operates in this particular fragile space. It turns hurricanes, sea level rise, coral reef degradation, coastal erosion into major economic and financial shocks that are macro critical to our economies. Fourth, these losses can then be translated into what we call climate debt, which is a measurable obligation owed by those most responsible for the emissions and historical accumulation to those who bear a disproportionate burden of those emissions. And therefore, the key shift is how we view the Caribbean as a recipient of climate finance flows, as a essentially and debt as a creditor to one. We move from a debtor status to one as a creditor on the global climate balance sheet. Right? And to do that, I want to highlight one example that shows that debt climate trap. Imana spoke around Dominica, and I believe Leah was going to speak around the Bahamas. But I just want to highlight Jamaica and the recent experience with Hurricane Melissa, which is another powerful example of this debt climate trap that we're talking about. And as we all remember, Melissa struck Jamaica as a catastrophic Category 5 hurricane at the end of October last year. The estimated loss and damages from that event was over 12 billion US dollars, or more than 57% of Jamaica's GDP. Those are the latest numbers that have come from the final loss and damage work done by the IDB. And that now, one, makes Hurricane Melissa the most costly storm to hit Jamaica after Hurricane Gilbert. And what it means is that at that 57% of GDP, it is going to significantly reverse a number of development gains. But most in particular, when we look from the viewpoint of debt, Jamaica has been one of those countries that has undergone significant fiscal consolidation and was able to reduce its debt significantly from around 145% of GDP in 2013 to just over 60% of GDP by 2024, just before around a year before Hurricane Melissa hit. But what we see now is after this major climate shock, recovery is again likely to be financed mainly through borrowing. And that in its sense is showing you that climate trap. The climate shock creates loss and damage. The government borrows to rebuild. That borrowing is reflected not only in higher debt, but much of that borrowing is commercial borrowing, so it's extremely expensive, and therefore it translates into higher debt service. Higher debt service means there are less resources for the government to invest in adaptation, social protection, and building out the resilient infrastructure. And therefore, what happens is the country becomes more vulnerable before the next shock arrives. And this is not only a Jamaican problem. This is a regional pattern across Caribbean SIDS. We have Dominica with Hurricane Maria. We have Bahamas with Dorian. We have Grenada first with Ivan, and more recently with Hurricane Beryl. And therefore, what it is that these countries are now sort of caught inside this debt climate trap. So the issue is not only about disaster recovery, it is also about fiscal justice. And that brings us to how we think about vulnerability in the Caribbean. And the dominant narrative is one that says vulnerability is a natural consequence of our geography. We are small islands. We have coastal populations. We have high exposure to hurricanes, and we have limited land space. That is a narrative, I think, that has to be seriously challenged because Caribbean vulnerability is really historically produced. And again, Imana, I think, went into great depth to show that, where the plantation economies prioritize export, monoculture, and metropolitan accumulation over domestic diversification. Our ecological systems were transformed through deforestation, soil depletion, mangrove destruction, and coastal degradation. And the land ownership patterns themselves push marginalized communities into flood-prone, coastal, or unstable areas. And at the time of independence, we actually inherited debt. And to finance our development part, we went back to the very colonial masters to provide that funding. And our experience really from the late 1980s showed that that post-colonial debt resulted in having to go to institutions such as the IMF and World Bank, which impose structural adjustment programs, and that further reduced the capacity of our islands to invest in resilience. And that's why the study links climate reparations to the broader Caribbean reparations project in the form of the CARICOM reparations project. But it argues that climate vulnerability is not separate from slavery, colonialism, and the extractive models of those regimes. Climate vulnerability is just one of the contemporary expressions of that model. When we look now at debt, what we see is that over time, Caribbean countries have been in what we would call a silent debt crisis, and we've just have the numbers here for a 30-year period, 3 decades. And it shows that by 2025, the average public debt across the Caribbean region was at 70% of GDP. But several countries were well above that level, particularly well over 100%. And these debt burdens limited the government's ability, as I said, to finance adaptation, resilient infrastructure, and even post-disaster recovery. And therefore, what it meant is that they this this debt turned climate harm into a mechanism of fiscal extraction, where the Caribbean pays twice. First, we pay through the direct losses caused by the climate shocks, and then we pay again through the debt service on the loans that are used to recover from those shocks. And therefore, for the Caribbean, climate reparations must therefore speak to structural fiscal repair. And that repair could take various forms, including debt cancellation, climate-linked debt restructuring, grant-based finance, but most importantly, how we restore sovereign policy space to Caribbean countries. And at the heart of this reparations claim is this striking asymmetry, where so we have this really beautiful table in the study, and what it shows is that the United States and Europe together account for more than 40% cumulative global carbon emissions between 1750 to 2024. Yet these countries rank among the lowest in terms of climate vulnerability and incur amongst the lowest climate-related damages as a percent of GDP. But if we contrast that to Caribbean countries that account for an extremely small proportion of historical emissions, yet they face some of the highest levels of climate vulnerability and incur recurrent climate losses that generally are equivalent to about between 5 to 15% of GDP each year. And therefore, what the study argues is based on that, what you have is this climate injustice where those least responsible are bearing the greatest harm, while those most responsible have accumulated wealth, infrastructure, and institutional protection. And therefore, the study argues that climate finance, therefore, cannot be understood as generosity from high-emitting states. It must be seen as a partial repayment of an outstanding obligation. And this then is a major conceptual shift. It moves the debate from how should climate finance be provided to really what is owed, by whom, to whom, and through what sort of mechanisms. And to bring home that story on climate debt a little closer, which is at the real core of our reparations framework, climate debt translate that historical responsibility and unjust enrichment into material obligation. It asks who has overused the atmospheric commons, who has benefited, and who has borne the cost. And if we look at three areas, the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom, what you see is that climate debt amounts to several trillions for these major historical emitters. Approximately $58 trillion for the United States and around 30 trillion for the European Union, if you use the cumulative emissions and the social cost of carbon we've used 185 US dollars. By contrast, Caribbean SIDS fall below equitable emissions threshold. They're therefore not climate debtors. They are ecological creditors. And this reverses the narrative that we've had in place for a long time. Because under the current system, Caribbean countries are treated as financial debtors asking for finance, climate finance, to deal with climate shocks. Under this climate debt framework, it is the high emitting states that are the debtors, and it is the Caribbean countries who are creditors, whose ecological space and development prospects have been appropriated. And this, I think, is a politically powerful narrative because it reframes climate finance from one of aid to one of restitution. And this brings us then to what this sort of reparations framework should look like. And they I think the key point here is that reparations should not be reduced to the notion of a single payment or a check. Reparations are an architecture. And I think that's an architecture that we've seen in the work that the Caribbean Reparations Commission has done. That architecture really has 6 major dimensions, each with a justice function. The first is acknowledgement, formal recognition of colonial and climate harm, and this establishes moral responsibility. The second dimension is restitution, where we look at measures such as land reform, relocation finance, and mobility rights that restore agency and safety. Third, rehabilitation for investment in health, education, housing, and what have you to repair social damage. Fourth, compensation, material redress for the loss and damage through fiscal transfers that do not create new debt. The fifth dimension is structural repair that seeks to restore fiscal autonomy. And the sixth, of course, is non-repetition, where you end the conditions that produce that harm. And that includes fossil fuel expansion, debt-based climate finance, and the institutional arrangements that prioritize creditors over climate survival. And what this architecture does is that it brings reparations into a framework that is both backwards looking and forward-looking. It addresses historical responsibility and accumulated harm, but it also seeks to transform the systems that continue to reproduce the very vulnerability of Caribbean small island states. I think that in itself is extremely important because we've not looked at how systematically we could transform the institutional conditions that continue to reproduce vulnerability. And that then brings us to the sort of what would this reparations entitlement look like? What would a conservative quantitative model produce? And again, I have to highlight this is extremely conservative. It is a model just designed to provide basic numbers that starts off the discussion, right, and moves into negotiation. It's not meant to be technically detailed, but enough to get us to start that sort of advocacy argument as needed. The model uses conservative assumptions. It estimates on those assumptions, it estimates a Caribbean reparations envelope of about 448.5 billion US dollars, which annualizes just around 2 billion a year between 2025 to 2015. In the paper, it actually shows what those estimates look like for a few Caribbean countries, about almost 23 billion for Jamaica. That number went up significantly because of Hurricane Melissa. 1.4 billion for Dominica. Much of that was because of Hurricane Maria. 1.7 billion for Grenada. A lot of that is accounted for by Hurricane Ivan. These numbers are politically important for two reasons. One, they are transformational for Caribbean states because they could significantly expand this fiscal space that Caribbean countries so desperately need. But most importantly, they're also fiscally modest for the historical omitters. If we use a $50 billion Caribbean reparations envelope, that's a tiny fraction of the entire GDP of the OECD. So barrier is not affordability, right? The barrier is recognition of the obligation. And I think that's why this model helps because quantification matters. It makes the claim visible. It provides a negotiable starting point, and it even makes it harder to dismiss political. So I think, yeah, this was what I was speaking to, right? And that then brings us to implementation, and therefore implementation requires a sort of framework again that we move from that quantitative model to how we get into the nitty-gritty of the reparations. And the reparations framework identifies several actors and primary roles, the key instrument assigned to that are relevant to those actors, what that arena of action should be, and the sort of expected outcome. This is in the table. I'm not going to speak to it directly, but I just want to focus on the civil society part because we here representing really civil society. This is a CPDC webinar. And what it does, it actually puts civil society at a very important point inside the climate reparations framework as having a primary role as a socio-political driver where civil society movements could engage in documentation like what we've done, quantification, even litigation, and the mobilization that's needed in the area of transnational advocacy, whether it's Caribbean, whether it's Caribbean and African alliances, and where the intent is public pressure to change towards the desired framework that we would like to see. And in doing that, we've outlined this sort of strategic sequencing that's needed just essentially to 2030, where there are essentially three main phases. 2026 to 27 is a consolidation phase, where you have CARICOM adopting a sort of climate reparations architecture that we've shown, the established National Reparations Unit and the evaluation studies done. And we've started this sort of coordinated regional messaging. The second phase from 2027 to 2028 is what we call the assertion phase, where Caribbean states could then pursue strategic litigation, build out bilateral reparations agreement, see how claims could be pursued through the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, and even how we could introduce corporate accountability mechanisms for a lot of the fossil fuel entities. The third phase from 2028 to 2030 is really a delivery phase, and that means how you scale these sort of reparations flows, how you integrate them into national fiscal frameworks, which I think is something that's missing and really needed, and how you build accountability systems and replicate successful pilots across the region. And in doing that, the study talks about Barbados as an important pilot to show how the framework could be implemented in practice. Why Barbados? One, because it combines acute climate exposure, fiscal vulnerability with strong institutions, credible data systems, and most importantly, international thought leadership, particularly through the initiatives such as the Bridgetown initiatives. And just to close off, what would this sort of system look like, into reparation system look like as we move forward? How do we move beyond that status quo? Under the status quo, climate finance remains loan heavy. Debt continues to rise and is unsustainable in many Caribbean countries. Governance remains international driven, particularly among donors, the IMF, the World Bank. Justice is really, in a sense, symbolic, and Caribbean countries continue to remain heavily dependent. Under the sort of reparations framework that we're looking at, finance becomes grant-based, debt is cancelled or restructured, governance is rights-based, justice becomes enforceable, and the desired outcome is greater sovereignty and self-determined development. And so the real question is not whether the international community is prepared to move from recognition to repair, is whether the Caribbean countries themselves, the political directorate, is ready to move from recognition to repair. Thank you very much.